13th tribe,
Khazar
empire,
and its heritage.
Intensive trading and cultural interchanges did not prevent the Rus from gradually eating their way into the Khazar Empire by appropriating their Slavic subjects and vassals. According to the primary Russian chronicle, by 859, that is, some 25 years after Sarkel was built, the tribute from the Slavic peoples was divided between the Khazars and the Vargarians from beyond the Baltic Sea. The Vargarians levied tribute on Chuds, Krivochians, etc., the more northerly Slavic people, while the Khazar continued to levy tribute on the Vyatachi, the Savani, and, most important of all, the Palyan in the central region of Kiev. But not for long. 3 years later, if we can trust the dating, in the Russian chronicle, the key town of Kiev, on the Dnieper, previously under Khazar suzerainty, passed into Rus hands. This was to prove a decisive event in Russian history, though it apparently happened without an armed struggle, according to the chronicle. Novgorod was at the time ruled by the semi-legendary Prince Rurik Hiroker, who held under his sway all the Viking settlements, the northern Slavic, and some Finnish people. Two of Rurik's men, Oskold and Dyer, on traveling down the Dnieper, saw a fortified place on a mountain, the sight of which they liked, and were told that this was the town of Kiev, and that it paid tribute to the Khazars. The two settled in the town with their families, gathered many Northmen to them, and ruled over the neighboring Slavs, even as Rurik ruled at Novgorod. Some 20 years later, Rurik's son, Og Helgi, came down and put Oskold and Dyer to death, and annexed Kiev to his sway. Kiev soon outshone Novgorod in importance. It became the capital of the Vargarians and the mother of Russian towns, while the principality which took its name became the cradle of the first Russian state. Joseph's letter, written about a century after the Rus occupation of Kiev, no longer mentions it in his list of Khazar possessions. But influential Khazar Jewish communities survived both in the town and province of Kiev, and after the final destruction of their country, they were reinforced by large numbers of Khazar immigrants. The Russian chronicle keeps referring to heroes coming from Zemula, Zadovskaya, the country of the Jews, and the gate of the Khazars. In Kiev, kept the memory of its erstwhile rulers alive till modern times. We have now progressed into the second half of the 9th century, and before continuing with the tale of the Russian expansion, must turn our attention to some vital developments among the peoples of the steppes, particularly the Magyars. Those events ran parallel with the rise of Rus power, and had a direct impact on the Khazars and on the map of Europe. The Magyars had been the Khazars' allies and apparently willing vassals since the dawn of the Khazar Empire. The problem of their origin and early wanderings have long perplexed scholars. McCartney wrote, "Elsewhere he calls it one of the darkest of historical riddles. About their origin, all we know with certainty is that the Magyars were related to the Finns, and that their language belongs to the so-called Finno-Ugarian language family, together with that of the Vogel and Ostyak people living in the forest regions of the northern Urals. Thus, they were originally unrelated to the Slavic and Turkish nations of the steppes in whose midst they came to live, an ethnic curiosity which they still are to this day. Modern Hungary, unlike other small nations, has no linguistic ties with its neighbors. The Magyars have remained an ethnic enclave in Europe, with the distinct Finns as their only cousins. At an unknown date during the early centuries of the Christian era, this nomadic tribe was driven out of its erstwhile habitat in the Urals and migrated southward through the steppes, eventually settling in the region between the Don and the Kuban rivers. They thus became neighbors of the Khazars, even before the later's rise to prominence. For a while, they were part of a federation of semi-nomadic people, the Onogurs, the 10 Arrows or 10 tribes. It is believed that the name Hungarian is a Slavic version of that word, while Magyar is the name by which they have called themselves from time immemorial. From about the middle of the 7th to the end of the 9th centuries, they were, as already said, subjects of the Khazar Empire. It is a remarkable fact that during this whole period, while other tribes were engaged in a murderous game of musical chairs, we have no record of a single armed conflict between Khazars and Magyars. Whereas each of the two was involved at one time or another in wars with their immediate or distant neighbors. Volga Bulgars, Dunabi Bulgars, Guz, Pichechians, and so on, in addition to the Arabs and the Rus. Paraphrasing the Russian Chronicle and Arab sources, Tonabi writes that throughout this period, the Magyars took tribute on the Khazars' behalf from the Slav and Finn peoples in the Black Earth zone to the north of the Magyars' own domain of the steppes, and in the forest zone to the north of that. The evidence for the use of the name Magyar by the state is its survival in a number of place names in this region of northerly Russia. These place names presumably mark the sites of former Magyar garrisons and outposts. Thus, the Magyars dominated their Slavic neighbors, and Tonabi concludes that in levying tribute, the Khazars were using the Magyars as their agents, though no doubt the Magyars made this agency profitable for themselves as well. The arrival of the Rus radically changed this profitable state of affairs. At about the time when Sarkel was built, there was a conspicuous movement of the Magyars across the Don to its west bank. From about 830 onward, the bulk of the nation was resettled in the region between the Don and the Dnieper, later to be named Lebedia. The reason for this move has been much debated among historians. Tonabe's explanation is both the most recent and the most plausible. We may infer that the Magyars were in occupation of the steppes to the west of the Don by permission of their Khazar suzerains. Since the steppe country had previously belonged to the Khazars, and since the Magyars were the Khazars' subordinate allies, we may conclude that the Magyars had not established themselves in this Khazar territory against the Khazars' will. Indeed, we may conclude that the Khazars had not merely permitted the Magyars to establish themselves to the west of the Don, but had actually planted them there to serve the Khazars' own purposes. This relocation of subject peoples for strategic reasons was a device that had been practiced by previous nomad empire builders. In this new location, the Magyars could help the Khazars to check the southeastward and southward advances of the Rus. The planting of the Magyars to the west of the Don will have been all of a piece with the building of the fortress Sarkel on the Don's eastern bank. This arrangement worked well enough for nearly half a century. During this period, the relation between Magyars and Khazars became even closer, accumulating in two events which left lasting marks on the Hungarian nation. First, the Khazars gave them a king, who founded the first Magyar dynasty, and second, several Khazar tribes joined the Magyars and profoundly transformed their ethnic character. The first episode is described by Constantine in De Administratio, circa 950, and is confirmed by the fact that the names he mentions appear independently in the First Hungarian Chronicle, 11th century. Constantine tells us that before the Khazars intervened in the international affairs of the Magyar tribes, these had no paramount king, only tribal chieftains. The most prominent of these was called Lebeditis, after whom Lebedia was later named. And Magyars consisted of 7 hordes, but at that time they had no ruler, either native or foreign, but there were certain chieftains among them, of which the principal chieftain was the aforementioned Lebedius. And on the Kagan, the ruler of Khazaria, on account of the Magyars' valor and military assistance, gave their first chieftain, the man called Lebeditis, a noble Khazar lady as a wife, that he might beget children of her. But Lebedius, by some chance, had no family by that Khazar woman. Another dynastic alliance which had misfired. But the Kagan was determined to strengthen the ties which bound Lebeditis and his tribes to the Khazar kingdom. After a little time had passed, The Kagan, the ruler of Khazaria, told the Magyars to send to him their first chieftain. So Lebedias, coming before the Kagan of Khazaria, asked him for the reason why he had sent for him. And the Kagan said to him, "We have sent for you for this reason, that since you are well born and wise and brave and the first of the Magyars, we may promote you to be the ruler of your race, and that you may be subject to our laws and orders." But Lebedias appears to have been a proud man. He declined. With appropriate expression of gratitude, the offer to become a puppet king, and proposed instead that the honor should be bestowed on a fellow chieftain called Almas, or on Almas's son Arpad. So the Kagan, pleased at this speech, sent Lebedias with a suitable escort back to his people, and they chose Arpad to be their king. The ceremony of Arpad's installation took place after the custom and usage of the Khazars, raising him on their shields. But before this Arpad, the Magyars never had any other ruler. Wherefore the ruler of Hungary is drawn from his race up to this day. This day, in which Constantine wrote, was circa 950, that is, a century after the event. Arpad, in fact, led his Magyars in the conquest of Hungary. His dynasty reigned till 1301, and his name is one of the first that Hungarian schoolboys and girls learn. The Khazars had their fingers in many historic pies. The second episode seems to have had an even more profound influence on the Hungarian national character. At some unspecified date, Constantine tells us there was a rebellion, apostasia, of part of the Khazar nation against their rulers. The insurgents consisted of 3 tribes, which were called Kavars, or Kabars, and which were of the Khazars' own race. The government prevailed, some of the rebels were slaughtered, and some fled the country and settled with the Magyars, and they made friends with one another. They also taught the tongue of the Khazars to the Magyars, and up to this day they speak the same dialect, but they also speak the other languages of the Magyars. And because they provided themselves more efficient in wars and the most manly of the 8 tribes, the 7 original Magyar tribes plus the Kabars, and leaders in war, they were elected to be the first horde, and there is one leader among them that is in the originally 3 hordes of the Kavars, who exist to this day. To dot his I's, Constantine starts his next chapter with a list of the hordes of Kavars and Magyars. First is that which broke off from the Khazars, this above-mentioned horde of the Kavars, etc. The horde or tribe which actually calls itself Magyars comes only third. It looks as if the Magyars had received, metaphorically and perhaps literally, a blood transfusion from the Khazars. It affected them in several ways. First of all, we learn, to our surprise, that at least Till the middle of the 10th century, both the Magyar and Khazar languages were spoken in Hungary. Several modern authorities have commented on this singular fact. Thus Bury wrote, "The result of this double tongue is the mixed character of the modern Hungarian language, which has supplied specious argument for the two opposite opinions as to the ethnical affinities of the Magyars." Tonaby remarks that though the Hungarians have ceased to be bilingual long ago, they were so at the beginnings of their state, as testified by some 200 loan words from the old Chavash dialect of Turkish, which the Khazars spoke. The Magyars, like the Rus, also adopted a modified form of the Khazar double kingship. Thus Gardenzi says, "Their leader rides out with 20,000 horsemen. They call him Kanda, in Hungarian Kendi. And this is the title of their greater king, but the title of the person who effectively rules them is Jula. And the Magyars do whatever their Jula commands." There is reason to believe that the first Julas of Hungary were Kabars. There is also some evidence to indicate that among the dissident Kabar tribes, who de facto took over the leadership of the Magyar tribes, there were Jews or adherents of a Judaizing religion. It seems quite possible, as Artemova and Bartha have suggested, that the Kabar apostasia was somehow connected with, or a reaction against, the religious reforms initiated by King Abadiah. Rabbinic law, strict dietary rules, Talmudic casuistry might have gone very much against the grain of these steep warriors in shining armor. If they professed a Judaizing religion, it must have been closer to the faith of their ancient desert Hebrews than to rabbinical orthodoxy. They may even have been followers of the fundamentalist sect of Karaites, and hence considered heretics. But this is pure speculation.